All right. Hey guys, Mr. T here. I know it has been forever since I have done a video, but for those of you who don't know, I've actually been in the process of moving. So the last 3, 4 weeks, I've been packing, loading boxes, loading U-Haul trucks, and all that. So I figured, I wanted to throw a video out there so you guys know that I'm still here. I'm still making videos. When I get free time, planning for new school year and what that's going to look like with the coronavirus and all this. I still want to throw some videos out there. And I thought, what better? I was just thinking about this. Sony just had their new release about their the PS5, Xbox, or Microsoft bounced back with some of their Xbox things. So I thought, why not talk about the history of video game consoles? It adds two of my favorite things, history and video games. So yeah, let's just jump right in. So a quick little overview for those of you who don't know. The home gaming consoles, these like the Nintendo Switch. Yes, this is the Pokemon one. This is literally a glorified Pokemon Shield player, because literally the only game on here is Pokemon Shield. I bought it so I could trade between Sword and Shield. But literally these home consoles, the whole home console thing where you sit in your own home on your own time and play at home on your own TV began really in like the 1970s, right? Arcades were still the main thing where you put the coins in, you play the things, you had like the two buttons in the stick, and most of you probably know of like Space Invaders, and Donkey Kong and stuff like that, things like that. That was the popular way. Consoles, like home consoles, they didn't really start becoming popular until the 80s, really even into the 90s is when they really started becoming popular. Nowadays, it's like video game consoles are everywhere. I mean, I don't know a person who doesn't have at least one home console. But back in the 70s, 80s, you really didn't see them that much. And then in the 90s is when they kind of started to become popular. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s is when they kind of skyrocketed. So this video, we're going to just talk about the quick history of them. We are currently on generation 8 of video game consoles. The Xbox Series X and the PS5 will actually be generation 9. And then whatever Nintendo decides to do. Nintendo's sticking to the Switch pretty hard right now. So Gen 1... Now, for dates and everything, I know some of the more hardcore history fans of video games will probably be like, where'd you get your date from? I based it off of a dozen different things. Some people, they base it off when the first console was released and when the last console was discontinued. I don't really like that model, because then you have some generations lasting 30 years. I mean, I think it was like generation 3 I saw, a history website about video games I saw, they put it lasting from like the early or the late 70s all the way up into the 2000s, and I'm thinking, no, I'm basing mine off when those consoles were in their prime, not when they were nostalgia, not when they were still being updated, but when they were in their prime. So when I start rushing out my dates for each generation, I'm talking about the main consoles when they were actually being bought and sold at their peak prices, their peak value, when everybody was actually really playing them as that main console, not as some side thing or nostalgia purposes. So Gen 1 is kind of the most boring of them all, because there were over 800 different consoles released. Some of these were crap. They had one game, that was it. You plug it into your TV and you were lucky if you got an hour out of it before it short-circuited. This was when everybody was just throwing something out there. I mean, IBM even had a console during this time. IBM and video games, let's be honest, okay? So the Gen 1 started in the early to mid 70s, and it lasted until the maybe mid to late 70s. Again, Generation 1 of home consoles corresponded with the arcade boom. So nobody wanted to buy a console and use it at home. They wanted to go down to the arcades, put the money in the arcade, listen to all the things. It was basically, well, I don't want to say child gambling, but it basically was gambling for kids, So everyone loved that arcade feel. The arcades were where you went and hung out after school. You brought your quarters with you, your weekly allowance and all that. That's what people loved. So the Generation 1 really didn't get a lot of love. Gen 2 came in, and that's when people started to feel the whole home console. Now, the winner of Gen 2, the one who sold the most, was the original Atari. I'm sure if I showed you a picture, everyone and their mother-in-law has seen it. It's the black box. It's got the black handle with the little like joystick on it and the one button on top. that was the supreme winner of Gen 2. Gen 2 began in the late 70s and it ended in the early 80s. Some people say it ended in 2013 because that's when the final Atari was released, or the remake, but again, we're talking about in their prime. So Gen 2 came in. It started to get people's feet wet in the home console experience, the idea of, owning your own video game at home. And then the crash hit. For those of you who don't know, the video game industry almost went away. In 1983 or 1982, 1983, the video game industry crashed. Sales plummeted. Like 90% of the people who were making video games went bankrupt or left the business altogether. I mean, even Nintendo was struggling during this time. I mean, think about that. Nintendo, like when you think video games, you think Nintendo was one of the big players. They're one of the big three. Even they were struggling during this time, right? So the 1983 crash, a lot of people thought that was it. Video games, they were a fad, they're done with, let's move on with our lives. And then Nintendo and several other smaller companies, they kind of revamped the system. In 1983, 1984, depending on where you lived, Nintendo released the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, okay? That would come later. But the NES really kickstarted the video game industry. I mean, yes, video games had been around for 10, 15, 20 years before this, or public, home video games. But the NES really showed that home consoles were not only a viable market, but a fun market, right? So the NES kickstarts Gen 3, and of course the NES, Nintendo's entertainment system, won Gen 3. I mean, it killed it, right? And this also put Nintendo on the market. Nintendo became the face of video games. Like, if you wanted to be in the video game industry, Nintendo was the company you were vying for. Now, there were some other major players. Atari was still around. I believe it was this generation where Sega started to become a player themselves, but Nintendo kind of was the front runner. And then Gen 4 hit. Late 80s, early 90s, Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Some people know it as the Super Famicom. So that Super NES comes out, it was over. It was done. Nobody could touch Nintendo. Nintendo were the supreme gods of the video game world, and at that point, you might as well give up. In Generation 4, the second highest selling console of Gen 4 was the Sega Genesis. I'm sure some of you have heard about that. It didn't even sell half as many units as the Super Nintendo. So Nintendo comes in, they have two back-to-back generations, not years, generations, each one spanning about 5 to 6 years, where they dominated. They came out of that crash the gods of the video game world. And then they shot themselves in their foot. They teamed up with this company called Sony. Okay? Nintendo and Sony teamed together, and they created a disc-based, because remember, for those of you who don't know, both NESs used cartridges. The ones where you blow into them, and that's how you fixed them, even though it says don't blow into it. Even though every time one didn't work, I always blew into it and it worked. But Nintendo was using cartridges, and companies were starting to go towards discs. So Nintendo teamed up with Sony and said, hey, you make us a Nintendo gaming system, and we'll put your name on it. Think about that. We almost, and you can Google this right now, we almost had a Sony-built Nintendo gaming system. Think about that. That means no PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 would have ever existed. We wouldn't have any of these PlayStation exclusives. It would be a Nintendo system built by Sony. Think about that for a second. And then Nintendo screwed them. Nintendo decided to go their own direction, and Sony was like, screw you, Nintendo. This was after the console was built. The console was built. You can even look up the prototypes of it. One of the prototypes just sold for like $500,000 a few months ago. Then Sony's like, fine, screw you, Nintendo. We'll make our own system, and that's where Gen 5 hits. Sony creates the PlayStation 1, and that put them on the market. Sony will now dominate Generation 5, which was the early to late 90s, for most of the 90s, and Generation 6. So Gen 5 and Gen 6 are going to go to Sony with the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2. Now, when when Generation 6 begins, the Gen 6 is late 90s. Actually, it was 1998 to 2005. So now that we're getting into these later generations, we have exact specific dates because there's a lot less consoles. Earlier generations, we're talking 15, 20, 30 consoles being released. Now we're talking 3 to 4. All right, so Gen 5 comes in, Sony dominates. They kick Nintendo off. Nintendo was actually, that Generation 5, Nintendo was Nintendo 64. And I know some of you are thinking, oh, that's cool. I know the games. The games are fun. Pokemon Stadium was fun. Super Mario 64 was fun. Super Mario Kart or Mario Kart was fun. But PlayStation killed it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I still love some of my original PlayStation games. And then PlayStation 2 came in. Nintendo's response was the Gamecube. I love the GameCube. Don't get me wrong. If Nintendo releases Super Mario Sunshine 2 or a remake for the Switch, I may or may not take off work for that day. But again, the PlayStation 2 is still amazing. Some of the greatest games ever were released on that. Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter. Right? I mean, those two series alone are some of my favorite series of all time, not just the PlayStation. So Sony is kicking butt. Now, side note, Nintendo and Sony are butting heads. Microsoft decides to jump in on the gaming world. So Gen 6 is when the first Microsoft product, the original Xbox, was created. The big black box, the green X on it. And that brought us some amazing series as well, like Halo. Don't get me wrong, Halo is amazing. Halo 4, Halo 5 was garbage, but Halo Reach, I am so excited to play Halo Infinite, which is Halo 6, because they basically said they're going to remake Reach. So that's Gen 6. Now, Nintendo, the super, grand king world, overlords of the video game industry, just got their butts handed to them twice. The 64 was a flop as far as numbers and units, and the GameCube was a flop. I mean, I think the original Xbox, outsold the GameCube. You know you're trash when Microsoft can beat you in a console. Right? I'm not a big PlayStation or Microsoft fan. Right? So we see that, Nintendo is getting their butts handed to them. They need to do something big. And that is when we get one of the most recognizable consoles in all of gaming history. And that is the original Wii. Okay? So Generation 7 begins in 2005. And this is when we get the PlayStation 3, the PS3, the original Wii, and the Xbox 360. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually liked the Xbox 360. The games for it were fun. That's when you had, you could play Halo 2 on it. I know Halo 2 was an original Xbox, but I played my Halo 2 mostly on my Xbox 360. You had the Call of Duty 2, which was a launch game for it. That one was not Big Red one, just Call of Duty 2. You had Halo 3, Halo Reach, Halo 4 came out, which again was, so Xbox 360 was actually pretty fun. But nothing could touch the Wii. Nintendo reasserted their dominance as the kings of the gaming world. The Wii is still one of the top 5 highest selling video game consoles of all time. Generation 7, starting in 2005, was also when Nintendo cemented themselves as the handheld kings. Right? The handheld that has the most sold, this right here, I actually have one. This was a Gen 6, the Game Boy Advance. I'm sure some of you remember seeing it. This is when Nintendo started to cement themselves as a king in the handheld world. The Game Boy Color and all that was also helpful. Then you have the Game Boy Advance. But then you have these devices right here, if I can find it. The DS, all right? Nintendo comes out with these. No one can touch them in the handheld world. I know the PlayStation tried with the PS Vita and the PSP Go and the PlayStation Portable. That was a fun console, but they could not touch Nintendo when it came to the handheld world. Now, Sony, being the powerhouse they once were with the PS2 and PS3, they needed to bounce, or the PS1 and PS2, they needed to bounce back, and that's where we get to our current generation of consoles, Gen 8. So the consoles we are in right now are called Generation 8. We have the Xbox One, the PS4, technically we count the Wii U, but I feel the Wii U is like an upgraded version. You know how we have the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X? I kind of feel that's what the Wii U is to the Wii. It's just an upgraded Wii, but technically the Wii U is a Gen 8 console, although it was a flop before it even came out. And then we also have the Nintendo Switch. Now, the Nintendo Switch, this one's a little tricky because some people count this as the first Gen 9 console. Nintendo did it kind of weird this time around. Now, of course, for anyone who doesn't know, the PS4 dominated the Generation 8 world. It is the third highest selling video game console of all time, and it's only like, what, 5 years old? Maybe, yeah, 6? So the PS4 killed it. The PS4 has actually sold more units than every other competitor put together. This is also an interesting generation. This and Generation 7 are interesting because there's only 3 companies left. Back in Gen 1, 2, and 3, we had 70, 80, 90 companies creating video game consoles. Now we only have 3, the big 3, Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft. So Generation 8 definitely went to Sony with the PlayStation 4. And I mean, let's be honest, the PlayStation 4 had exclusives that took the floor with Microsoft and really had a leg up on Nintendo. Now, the Nintendo Switch, it was released late. It was released halfway through this generation. And I wholeheartedly believe if the Nintendo Switch was released at the beginning of the generation, I think it would have been a lot closer, maybe even surpassing the PS4 in sales. But because it was released so late, it kind of got a lackluster start. It did surpass the Xbox, though. The Xbox One is actually the worst selling console of this generation, technically second to worst if you count the Wii U, but PlayStation 4 dominated. Now, Gen 9. This one is starting in 2020. This holiday season is when the Xbox Series X and the PS5 are supposed to come out. Nintendo hasn't announced a Gen 9 console. They're sticking to the Switch at this point. But it's going to be big to see who can come out on top because Sony is going off of a phenomenal trend right now. Other than the Wii, Sony has dominated the last 3 out of 4 generations. The PS1, the PS2, and the PS4 have all won their generations, and the PS3 was the second highest selling of its generation. So we see that Sony is going in on a pretty big high note right now. Microsoft hasn't even gotten second place on any of its generations. I think it beat the Gamecube, but that's it. So we see going into this next generation of video games, will Microsoft pull one out and actually beat Sony? Or will Sony stay as the reigning champs? And who knows, maybe Nintendo will come out with something even better than the Switch and wipe them both off the maps. My thoughts are, I think the PS5 is going to kill it, mostly because of the exclusives at launch. I mean, some of the exclusives like the new Ratchet & Clank game, the new Horizon Zero Dawn or Forbidden West game, those 2 alone I think are going to kill it. With the addition of the new Spider-Man add-on, the Spider-Man Miles Morales, Sony is going to be starting pretty good with some set games. And that's just my opinion on the games I like, not to mention the other ones that are coming out or the other rumored ones that are coming out. So I hope you guys like this video. I just wanted to throw something out there, just get something out there to show you guys I'm still making videos. Little information, history, and video games put together. So if you want to see more video game videos, just comment or like below. You should comment or like anyways because, I'm awesome. So keep gaming. If you're under 17, make sure you ask your parents before you play an M-rated game. If you're under 13, make sure you ask your parents before you play a PG-13 game. And Fortnite is trash. Thank you. And as always, stay beautiful, Americans. Peace.